Good evening, young scholars, and it's time for yet another podcast on various topics in AP World and European history. Obviously, the primary goal for today is to look at the Russian Revolution and then the early phases of life in the Soviet Union. So, before we begin, let's start with just a little bit of a Russia recap. You will recall that in the 19th century, we found a Russia that was struggling to some degree with its identity. It was sort of vacillating back and forth between, do we want to really sort of hold true to our Russianness, our autocracy, the Greek Orthodox Church, our sort of legacy from the Eastern world, and particularly from sort of the Byzantine Empire, or are we going to embrace this new sort of westernized European, quote unquote, modern worldview? And depending on exactly which czar you're looking at, that's being pursued with different degrees of energy. So generally speaking, by the time we get to the 20th century, we see a couple of things. Russia is still largely unindustrialized, with the notable exception of some of the major cities like Petrograd, which is the Russian name for St. Petersburg, and Moscow. One factory in Petrograd, in fact, in the 19 teens, was the largest factory in Europe, with 30,000 workers within its walls. So again, Petrograd, Moscow, some of your larger cities, very highly industrialized, quite advanced. Streetcars, electricity, the whole bit. The rest of Russia, much less so, particularly when you get out of the sort of western side of the country. The farther you go towards sort of Siberia and what is today Kazakhstan and some of those areas, far less developed. You remember we do have a Trans-Siberian Railway that is developed in the late part of the 19th and early 20th century under Sergei Witta, who is one of Nicholas II's ministers. But again, this is still a state that is largely composed of a peasant population with a relatively small, although increasingly influential, bourgeois class. We should also make note of the fact that this is a multi-ethnic empire, particularly farther east, and then also sort of in the south in what is today Ukraine, Georgia, Ossetia, some of those areas, right? So we do have some of the same problems that we saw in the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires there, where you have these peoples that, because of the spread of nationalism from Western Europe, are beginning to advocate for a little more autonomy within the empire. That's causing some problems. In general, we want to make sure that we're thinking of Russia in some of the same terms in this period that we were looking at late 18th century France. Right? We have a lot of things in common. We are going to see a state that is highly autocratic, that is very restrictive in terms of freedom of speech. But in spite of that, because of the spread of various ideas, sort of we could call them Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment ideas in the case of Russia, we do have a body within the state that is starting to become a little more organized and starting to develop a certain level of activism. Popular protest is becoming more common. And then, of course, we have these sort of a state on the verge of financial or of economic change, and that is in part being brought on by the various cataclysms of state debt and war and all that sort of thing, right? So we're like revolutionary France, revolutionary Russia is experiencing some of those same issues. We definitely want to remember in particular that in 1905, after the failure of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, we are going to have a revolution back home. Essentially, a large percentage of the working classes, what Marx would have called the proletariat, are responding to the seeming weakness of the government. They're responding to their lack of say in the government. They're responding to the fact that the industries are inefficient and that some of the economic inefficiencies are sometimes leading to famine. So in 1905, we have these marches where people are striking and marching and calling for those liberal reforms that originally they were beginning to get under Alexander II, but that under Alexander III and Nicholas II have largely been suppressed. Um, and so we certainly need to keep that in mind. Um, and then, of course, in January, one of these marches ends when the order is given for the soldiers to fire into the crowd on Bloody Sunday. Again, that's in January of 1905. They kill about 130 people. And this is going to be bad for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, it's not going to play very well in the press, and it certainly is going to indicate to the population that the government is not willing to hear their concerns. But perhaps more importantly, this sort of myth that the Tsar has been trying to perpetuate for centuries now of the Tsar as being sort of the father of his people, this sort of holy figure, is being shattered when you have soldiers sort of blithely firing into a crowd of hungry protesters. So as a result of this, there are actually some mutinies in branches of the military. The battleship Potemkin, the crew of that ship mutinies in Ukraine. And meanwhile, these sort of various socialist groups, which are technically illegal and underground, are starting to sort of gain some strength. Membership in workers' unions is increasing. There's more terrorist attacks, more strikes, and so in response to this, Nicholas publishes the October Manifesto of 1905. He says, okay, I have heard you guys, I get it. So we're going to open up freedom of the press, we're going to have male suffrage, and I'm going to create that Duma, that large national legislative body that was going to be put in place by Alexander II prior to his being killed. But that doesn't necessarily satisfy everybody. In December, there are some more violent uprisings, and so in response to that, Nicholas bans these sort of councils of workers that are called Soviets, and 1,000 people are actually killed. And so this is pretty ugly stuff. Now, to make matters worse, in these years, 1905, 1906, 1907, after we established the Duma, Nicholas and the Duma have to figure out how to get along. And of course, Nicholas is not used to his prerogatives being questioned. The Duma is perhaps looking for a little freer hand than he is willing to give them based on the models that they've seen in places like Great Britain and France and so on. And so they do not get along at all. Nicholas, in particular, refuses to compromise on land reform, and he actually sort of tries to get around the Duma by establishing a state council that is made up of nobles and military and church leaders. He dissolves the Duma in 1906. He allows them to be reelected in 1907, and then they cause more trouble, and he dissolves them again. So again, this is a state where our attempts at liberalism are being sort of nerfed or stymied by the autocracy of the Tsar. Now, meanwhile, we actually need to pop down here and actually talk about the Tsar and his family for just a moment. Nicholas, of course, who I actually do not have a picture of in here. That is. So Nicholas is the son of Alexander III. He is a relatively, by most accounts, a superstitious man, number one, a man who is very convinced of the power of God and of the fact that God has placed upon him this responsibility of being the Tsar. He has this responsibility to rule, but he doesn't seem to much like it. He doesn't have a great deal of ambition. And, in a time when Russia really sort of needed a Peter or an Alexander II or even a Catherine, they sort of got Nicholas, who is this guy who's superstitious, he's conservative, and he really sort of sees ruling Russia as kind of a burden, and really all in all, if he had had his own way about it, he probably would have been perfectly happy just sort of being a country gentleman somewhere and sort of hanging out and raising his family. Nicholas has a relatively large family, as you can see. First of all, there's his wife, Alexandra. Alexandra, like Nicholas, is distantly related to Queen Victoria. She, in fact, was actually born of German descent, and she was actually raised in England for much of her life before she married Nicholas and became the Tsaritsa. Um, so she is also superstitious and conservative. She exercised a great deal of influence over her husband, and she is going to be particularly unpopular in Russia, especially during World War One, when Russians are fighting against Germans, and they see Alexandra as a possible sort of German spy or German influence in the Tsar's court. And again, here I think we can draw parallels to the French Revolution with the notion of Marie Antoinette being viewed in much the same way. So now moving on to the children, who don't necessarily play an enormous political role, but they're definitely worth mentioning. We have the four daughters, who are Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia or Anastasia, and Maria. And then we also have a son, Alexei. Um, Again, their role in sort of the drama of the revolution is perhaps not particularly important. However, um, because of the sort of gruesome circumstances surrounding their death and because they were royalty, their lives are relatively well documented. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in class, but I think that it is particularly important for us to take note of this family, in part because they were strangely unroyal for autocratic monarchs. All of the daughters at various points during World War One served as nurses in hospitals, and actually their mother Alexandra did as well. One of them actually had a romantic relationship with an army officer that she tended for, who bought her a French bulldog puppy. And we actually have photos of Nicholas teaching his son Alexei to swim. We have photos of him teaching his daughter Anastasia how to smoke cigarettes. Anastasia seems to have been a little bit of a loose cannon, maybe a tiny, somewhat the black sheep of the family. So these are a people who, in spite of the fact that they were in this position of sort of enormous power and wealth, lived relatively down-to-earth lives. We don't have a lot of stories about the Romanovs sort of engaging in sort of the wild parties that we think of, Marie Antoinette being involved in that kind of thing. And so it's important for us to remember their story. I think for those reasons, we'll talk about that a lot more as we go on. The one final point I should make here is that the boy Alexei, the Tsarevich, the crown prince, was a very sickly child. Through his mother, and actually via Queen Victoria, he had inherited a condition called hemophilia, which makes it difficult for one's blood to clot properly, which means that a bruise or a cut can potentially be very, very dangerous. Um, and so his family sort of was always living in fear of him dying, because obviously he was the last child to be born, and he was the crown prince, and so he was very, very important. You also notice in a lot of pictures of him, he's wearing sailor uniforms. He seems to have been very enamored with sailors and sailing and the notion of the Navy, not unlike his progenitor, Peter the Great. And so even a lot of his sort of servants and attendants would also be dressed as naval men. They sort of engaged. And in fact, the whole family was very involved in the army. Many of the Grand Duchesses, the daughters, had sort of honorary positions as sort of commanders or overseers of particular army units. and they would go out and sort of watch them drill and all that sort of thing, which is something that certainly would not have been done in the West. So we do need to remember that in spite of the sort of economic and social and political backwardness with which we as Westerners tend to view 19th and early 20th century Russia, that in some ways they are continuing to be very progressive. And so again, I think the family is a reflection of that. So moving on. We have talked about what's going on prior to the revolution, so let's now get to World War One. As we discussed, Russia is drawn into World War One in part because of their various treaty commitments to the French and so forth and so on, and also their commitment to the Serbians, who they see as sort of their pan-Slavist brothers. And so initially, a lot of the sort of political infighting and the disagreements are sort of set aside because now we have this external enemy in the Germans and the Austrians that we're trying to defeat. Unfortunately, right from the first, the war goes exceedingly poorly. The Russian army is, of course, slower to mobilize and less well equipped than their European counterparts because they're not as industrialized and all that sort of thing. So they're a little bit late showing up to the fight. When they do finally get involved, they invade Prussia and are attempting to take the city of Königsberg, which is a really important political and economic center in sort of the eastern part of the German Empire. They actually marched their army towards an area called Tannenberg, I should say. Tannenberg, the problems for the Russian army at Tannenberg are many. Number one, they did not realize until they got there that the German trains ran on a different gauge of rail than the Russian trains did. So all these trains they had brought with them to transport all their stuff was suddenly not usable, which means that their supplies were being moved very slowly. It meant the army had to walk everywhere instead of being moved around by train and having more energy, more strength to fight when they got there. They also didn't have enough telegraph wire, which means they had to do a bunch of their sort of passing of orders and their planning over open phone lines, which the Germans could tap into and listen to very, very easily. And so as a result of this, at the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, the Russian army is entirely crushed. Of the Russian force that is sent into this battle, which is about 230,000 men, 100,000 of them are captured, and another 80,000 are killed or wounded. So I mean, this is just an enormous percentage of the army. It was so bad, in fact, that one of the generals, rather than actually have to go back to Petrograd and report this incredibly ignominious defeat to the Tsar Nicholas, he kills himself. The Russian army, both in terms of their officer corps and in terms of the training and the supplies provided to their men, were completely unprepared for this war in a way that is very different from the rest of Europe. Now, of course, nobody in Europe was prepared for this war to go on as long as it did. Nobody was prepared for these changes in technology that sort of invalidated a lot of their tactics. The Russians are all of those things and more. And in spite of the fact that in 1915, 1916, the Tsar Nicholas II, I do have a picture of him, he's right here, and his troops, you can see, are sort of kneeling to him almost as a religious figure. The Tsar actually decides, because of the failures of his generals, that it is his sort of sacred duty to go to the front and take control of the war himself, which, again, when you've got a weak-willed man who's not particularly good at his job and you're asking him to manage an army of almost 15 million soldiers, that's not going to go real well. So first, his generals and then Nicholas really failed to do a decent job with this war effort. Russian losses are pretty staggering. And, by the time we get to 1915, 1916, we're losing well over 1 million men a year. So it's a really nasty, really hard conflict for the Russians. Now, on top of that, because of the sort of traditional disruptions that we see of the economy as the result of a war like this, we also have a lot of shortages. By the time we get to 1917, a number of people in Russia are starving. People can't get basic goods that they need because the government is working so hard to produce military material. This isn't like the rationing that we see in the United States, where like you only got a pound of sugar this month. We're talking about some very severe, life-threatening types of shortages. And obviously, as we saw in the French Revolution, when you take a bunch of dissatisfied poor people and you start putting them in a position where they can't get food, that tends to cause problems very quickly. And then, of course, as always, we have these liberals who are largely in the middle and upper classes who are calling for reform. They're saying, listen, Nicholas and his generals are a bunch of bozos. They're doing a terrible job managing the war effort. They're doing a terrible job managing the economy. It is time for us to use this war as a catalyst to develop real democratic institutions in Russia. Like, that's the reason we're failing so hard. That's why all these European countries are so behind. And then, of course, in addition to that, you've got those traditional sort of nationalist disruptions. We've got Muslims in Central Asia. We have Lithuanians, Poles, Ukrainians who are sort of wanting independence. They're trying to take advantage of the situation as well. And then you've got these huge movements of Russian people as the government forces many, many, many peasants to relocate to the cities to take on factory jobs for the war effort. And again, I would argue this is going to lead us towards a revolution, because one thing we saw in the 19th century is when all these poor people get together and start realizing that they share common experience, we have the development of class consciousness, and particularly given that a lot of our revolutionaries in Russia are socialists, and many of them Marxist socialists at that, they're going to want to use that sort of poor class consciousness to generate greater support. And then, of course, in true Russian fashion, the worse it gets, the more oppressive the Tsar's police forces are going to become, the more aggressive they're going to be in terms of arresting people. And of course, that's going to then turn around and make those worker groups even more belligerent. Remember that in revolutions, violence tends to beget greater violence. So, add to that the fact that while Nicholas is gone trying to manage things at the front, he leaves his wife Alexandra in charge. We mentioned the fact that she is very unpopular, not only because she's German, but also because she has this hanger-on named Grigory Rasputin, who you see pictured here. This is not a man you would leave your children with. Rasputin is a pretty interesting guy, actually, in a lot of ways. He is a monk from Eastern Russia. He is a sort of a relatively devout holy man who people believe can sort of have these strange visions and maybe some supernatural powers. He is also a member of a sort of bizarre Russian cult that believes that in order to sort of get the sin out of your mind and out of your soul, you have to commit those sins. So he spends a lot of his time engaging in orgies, in sex with prostitutes, in public drunkenness. And, in other words, he's spending a lot of time doing what he considers to be sort of getting the sin out of his body, and what everybody else considers to be him just being a reprobate and a degenerate and all of that sort of thing. So this makes him the kind of person that a lot of people don't think the Tsaritsa and the Tsar's family should be hanging out with. However, he seems to be somebody who is able to, if not entirely cure, provide some comfort for Alexei. Supposedly, he would go to Alexei and somehow supernaturally take the pain from Alexei's body, and then Alexei would feel better. So as a result of this, Tsaritsa Alexandra referred to Rasputin as our friend, and he spent a lot of time at the palace. He sort of started becoming an unofficial advisor to the Tsar and to his wife, which was also not popular. Eventually, Rasputin is actually going to be killed by, allegedly by this man, Yusupov, who was related to the Tsar by marriage. His wife was the Tsar's niece. And actually, he's kind of an interesting guy too. Supposedly, he was an avid fan of cross-dressing, but he felt that having this Rasputin guy around was a big problem, and so he supposedly invited Rasputin over to his house, and they were hanging out in the wine cellar drinking. He fed Rasputin enough cyanide, both in his drinks and in some cakes, to kill an elephant. Rasputin did not die. He then shot him. They then clubbed him, and then they wrapped him in chains and threw him into the Neva River. And supposedly, when his body was found, um, they found water in his lungs, which would tend to indicate that he had died of drowning rather than all these other remarkable things that had been done to his body. Yusupov, by the way, later on ended up fleeing Russia during the revolution and moving to France, where he ran into Grigory Rasputin's daughter, because Grigory Rasputin did have two children, a son and a daughter. No one knows what happened to the son. But the daughter ended up in Paris and became a tiger trainer, and she actually sued Yusupov in a French court to try and get some sort of punishment for him for this murder. And the French government kind of just threw up their hands and said, nah, not our jurisdiction, sorry. So again, kind of an interesting tale. But this is reflective of the fact that even sort of the high nobility are sort of looking at the monarchy and going, man, they seem to be making a lot of really poor decisions. And so there is that. So where does this leave us? Well, in February of 1917, which actually was technically February according to the Russian calendar, but not actually February according to everybody else, because the Russian calendar is 12 or 13 days behind. In February 1917, all of this kind of boils over. The mismanagement of the war, the shortages of food and other materials, the lack of democratic institutions, the autocracy of the Tsar and his police, it all just kind of bubbles over. And on the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, 200,000 workers go on strike. This is going to continue through January into February. There are going to be more strikes. There are going to be more riots. And finally, Nicholas sends a message from the front giving the soldiers orders to fire on the crowd and suppress the riots. The soldiers do not, in fact, fire on the crowd. Many of them, in fact, join the revolt. As a result of this, Nicholas tries to dissolve the Duma again, which he blamed for stirring up or fomenting this rebellion. But they actually take a vote and vow not to be pushed aside. And again, I think this should remind us of our tennis court oath. So even though it seems that, hey, we've got this huge popular protest movement developing, we've got this Duma that's refusing to back down, and it seems like the revolution is very much underway, we need to keep in mind that we do have a problem here that should remind us a little bit of the revolutions of 1848 in Austria. Everybody's revolting, but not everybody's revolting for the same reason. We have workers who are demanding food and land and economic reform of various kind. We have liberals and nationalists who are advocating for, governmental changes. We have this increasingly class-conscious and active working class that is really demanding more say, and that's one thing that is going to make this revolution very different from France. Whereas in France, the sort of bourgeois, upper-class intellectuals were able to, for the most part, direct the course of the revolution. That's not going to be the case here. So Nicholas the Tsar is finally forced to abdicate in March of 1917 in favor of his brother, who actually refuses, and then in favor of his son, Alexei. And so with that done, a bunch of these guys in the Duma, led by this gentleman here, Alexander Kerensky, decide that they are going to step up and form a provisional government. This is a government that is going to sit in place while we look at writing a constitution and getting through the war and trying to kind of wrap all of this business up. There is a problem, however. All of these workers in Petrograd have established the Petrograd Soviet, which is sort of the Petrograd Workers' Council, if you will. And because they are so deeply involved, and because we have a lot of revolutionary Marxists running around talking to these workers, and because the revolution kind of began on the backs of these, worker strikes, the Petrograd Soviet is going to refuse to sort of sit by and just let the provisional government run the show entirely. In some cases, they're kind of working together, but in some cases, the two kind of contradict each other. The Petrograd Soviet is almost working kind of like a parallel government, if you will. In fact, they issue a statement claiming the authority to veto the provisional government on certain military matters. So in the wake of this revolution happening, we have chaos starting to break out. Nobody's 100% sure, are we supposed to be listening to this provisional government? Are we supposed to be listening to the Petrograd Soviet? Who's really in charge here? And that's going to cause a lot of problems. And then, of course, a lot of those nationalist groups are going to take this as an opportunity to sort of take advantage of the chaos to try and gain more autonomy, or maybe even break away. Now, the first thing we need to think about here is that the provisional government, their primary decision, their first big decision, is that they are going to stay in World War I. And that's going to cost them a lot of support in the lower classes, because obviously that means that the economic troubles are going to continue. It means that Russian soldiers who are sometimes going into battle without guns and being told to, pick up the guns of their fallen brothers, they're being told that the war is going to go on, and more of them are going to die. And so that obviously is unpopular. And this may seem like a strange decision. Like, if you're in the middle of a revolution, why would you want to be fighting a war against one of the best trained, best equipped land armies in the world, which is, Germany. But I think we need to keep in mind here that the provisional government is trying very hard to deal with a lot of really bizarre problems. On the one hand, they are very westward leaning. I mean, even looking at Kerensky, he almost looks like an Oxford, Don. He's got the tie and the collar and all that sort of stuff. They are hoping very, very much to receive support and recognition and help of various types from the Western allies, the British, the Americans, the French, excuse me. And so that's one problem. Also, how do we sort of maintain our international credibility so that we can get the loans and the economic aid if we bail out of the war? How do we satisfy all of these different groups of people? Because even though the workers want out of the war, there are still a lot of nobles and conservatives and even sort of middle of the road liberals who are saying no. Like, this war is about preserving Russia and saving ourselves from the German abomination. We've got to stay in this thing. We have to win. And then, of course, the provisional government is also trying to create democracy where there is none. The provisional government is a little bit like a rebound girlfriend, or boyfriend for that matter. The Russians have been in a very long-term relationship with the autocracy of the Tsar, and now they're just sort of looking for anything different. But what they realize relatively quickly with the provisional government is maybe this isn't exactly what we were bargaining for, even though it's what we said we wanted. And so, that this isn't really going to last very long. So into this just big mess that the provisional government, the Petrograd Soviet, and everybody else in Russia find themselves, we must also introduce for the first time, I should say, in some ways, this man, Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin was a man who, from a very early age, had been a political agitator and a leftist and a socialist and just all-around person that the Russian government was not particularly fond of. His older brother Sasha had in fact also been a political agitator, and he had been killed or executed, I should say, in connection with a plot to assassinate then Tsar Alexander III. So Lenin had grown up with this desire for political change, political reform in his blood. He read the works of Karl Marx and became an avowed socialist, and was subsequently actually exiled out of Russia. He was living in Switzerland when World War I broke out. Now, in 1917, the Germans, who very badly wanted to see the Russians knocked out of the war, said, hey, why don't we make sure that this Lenin guy gets back into Russia? So they actually put him on a sealed railway car, and sent him back into Russia, where he arrived in 1917. Now, there's something very, very important that we need to bear in mind about Lenin, because this is going to inform a lot of his later decision making. Um, Lenin largely agreed with most of Marx's philosophy. He bought the whole proletariat revolution thing and the history is class struggle thing and the bourgeois thing and all that sort of stuff. The one thing that he didn't necessarily buy is this notion that the revolution of the proletariat will occur naturally at some point after the society has evolved so far. He rather believed that the people need to be led into revolution by a dedicated group of revolutionaries. In this way, he is somewhat similar to the Jacobins of revolutionary France. He says we can't just wait for this to sort of happen. We've got to force it to happen, and it'll be better for everybody that way if we just sort of make it happen. This is going to draw the really clear distinction between Marxism and what we refer to as Bolshevism, which is the philosophy of the Bolsheviks. This is one of several revolutionary Marxist parties in Russia to which Lenin belonged and which he sort of took over when he got back into Russia in 1917. He published a document called the April Theses, which I think is a relatively clear reference to Martin Luther, in which he argued that what we need to do is, number one, get out of World War I. Number two, we need to dispose of the provisional government and have this sort of workers' revolution. Number three, we need to have the peasants sort of seize all the large noble estates and all the land and divide it up amongst themselves. And then finally, we need to see this workers' revolution spread all over Europe. He argued that even though this sort of violated Marx's formula, he said that the war had essentially allowed the proletariat to rise up in the February Revolution, and what the bourgeois needed to do now is to back the proletariat and join them. And these Soviets that had been created, these sort of groups of workers, these workers' councils that were popping up all over Russia as a result of the establishment of the Petrograd Soviet, were sort of the cocoon from which this new society would grow. He said they should be the basis on which a new state run by what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry could be formed. Lenin got about this plan relatively quickly. In July, the Bolsheviks attempted to have a coup that was going to overthrow the provisional government. They got a bunch of soldiers onto their side. They had a newspaper called Pravda that was printing a lot of propaganda in their favor, but it didn't go well. And actually, after the first day of the of this attempted revolution called the July Days, when Lenin and the other Bolsheviks began to realize that, this isn't going exactly as we planned. They actually tried to call it off, but by that point it was kind of too late. And so the provisional government managed to come in. They shut down the Bolshevik headquarters and closed down their paper. They arrested a number of their leaders. And Lenin was forced to go into exile again, this time in Finland. Now, there's an important concept that we need to remember here from our French Revolution. Violence and fear tends to lead to more violence and fear. And so after the July Days, we have a lot of very worried conservatives in Russia who are saying, the instability and the weakness of the provisional government is leaving us open to being sort of taken over and dominated by the far left, by these crazy socialists who are going to sort of completely upend our society. And so some nobles and businessmen and members of the army start getting together and talking about, what if what if we launched a coup? What if we launched a military coup and established a military dictatorship just to get us through the war? And then after the war, we can sit down and have a meaningful conversation about what we want Russia to look like. But right now, like we got to get through the war, and maybe a military government that it comes in and institutes martial law is going to be the way to do that. And most of this plot centered around the commander-in-chief of the army, General Kornilov. And hence it is known as the Kornilov Affair. And this takes place in sort of the late summer and early fall of 1917, when these conservatives are talking about the idea of a military coup. It ends up not happening, but it is going to sort of further polarize Russian society because, obviously the conservatives are already scared witless of the Soviets, and of the Marxist revolutionaries, and now the Marxist revolutionaries, who are known as the Reds, are saying, listen, if we don't get in there and strike now, these conservatives are going to come after us. Like, look at this Kornilov affair that almost happened, right? Bad news bears. Bad news bears. So, in October, the Bolsheviks decide they are going to try again. They write up a bunch of new propaganda to make the provisional government look bad. They get the support of a number of soldiers, particularly in Petrograd, and also a number of armed workers they managed to sort of distribute guns to. You see some of them above here. And under the leadership of one of the Bolshevik leaders, Leon Trotsky, who was actually a Jew from a relatively wealthy peasant family who took his name, Leon Trotsky, actually from one of his guards when he had been in prison. Um, these sort of this like workers' army, if you will, that is working for the Bolsheviks, run through St. Petersburg, capture most of the major districts, the major bridges, a lot of the headquarters of various buildings, and all that kind of stuff. And they basically force the provisional government to flee the city. And once they've got control of Petrograd, they kind of have control of the government. They actually, a few of the government ministers tried to hold out in the Winter Palace. The Tsar, of course, was not even there. And a battleship that was under control of these soldiers who were allied with the Reds lobbed a couple of shells at the Winter Palace, and after that, what was left of the provisional government just completely fell apart. And so the Bolsheviks took control of St. Petersburg, and relatively quickly started moving to sort of secure their control of the government more broadly. Now, in this sort of Congress of Soviets that had been meeting, in connection with the Petrograd Soviet, there were a number of people other than Bolsheviks. There were a group called the Mensheviks, who are sort of slightly more moderate slightly more moderate Marxist revolutionaries, the Mensheviks. And then there's also a lot of sort of middle of the road leftists, liberals who aren't necessarily looking for this huge socialist revolution. Most of the Mensheviks and the liberals walk out of this Congress of Soviets in protest because they said, hey, listen, we were trying to work with the provisional government. You're creating more instability by launching this coup, and you're making a big mess. The Reds, the Bolsheviks, don't much care. They are able to very quickly gain relatively broad support in the working classes in industrial areas. They're not doing quite as well further out into the countryside or on the edges of the empire where ethnic Russians are the minority. But again, once you've got control of St. Petersburg and Moscow, like sort of the big industrial centers, you largely control the country. And this is during a period when they talk about the revolution by telegraph, where as the message spreads from Petrograd that the city is now controlled by the Bolsheviks, a lot of other sort of Bolshevik and Marxist groups that have been waiting in the wings kind of rise up and join the Bolsheviks with Lenin and Trotsky at their head. Under Lenin, this revolutionary government is going to seize control of banks. They're going to close newspapers, and they're going to be very hardline and very domineering. In fact, they're frankly going to look an awful lot like the Tsarist regime under an Alexander III or a Nicholas II. Leon Trotsky, who just, what a great mustache, supposedly said, "We shall not enter the kingdom of socialism in white gloves on a polished floor." In other words, we're gonna have to break some eggs in order to make this omelet. So you guys just need to deal with it. In December of 1917, they also start arresting people who disagree with them, much as Nicholas did, and they establish their own secret police, which is called the Cheka, Cheka, and they are going to be the precursors to the KGB in a lot of ways. They also publish another document that is called the Declaration of the Rights of Toiling and Exploited People. Again, I think we have a clear reference to the sort of Enlightenment revolutionaries of the 18th century in France and elsewhere. This coup is going to lead to civil war. We're going to have a civil war with the Bolsheviks, who are called the Reds, fighting on one side, and you can see, again, their major area of control is that sort of, if you want to call it this, the industrial heartland of Russia, that western part of Russia that is closest to the war front with Germany. And then they're called the Reds, and then there's going to be their opponents, who are called the Whites. The Whites are largely led by General Kornilov, who you'll remember from the Kornilov affair. And the Whites largely hold the eastern sides of the country, Siberia, some of the areas around the Ural Mountains, and all that sort of thing, and also some of the territories in Ukraine and Georgia and Azerbaijan, all those areas. So now Russia, in addition to fighting a war against the Germans, is also having to deal with a civil war, which puts Lenin in an awfully tough place. And this civil war is going to get relatively nasty. First of all, because Trotsky and some of the other Bolshevik leaders are Jews, the White Guards are going to engage in a lot of anti-Semitic behavior. This is again, we've got this notion, which we're going to see over and over and over and over in Europe in the 20th century. We're going to have this notion of a sort of Jewish socialist conspiracy that is, sort of menacingly trying to swallow all of us. So they're going to engage in a lot of pogroms. That's Pogroms, which are these sort of riots against the Jewish community where they attack and kill a lot of Jews. There's also on both sides, the Reds and the Whites, there's going to be a ton of killing and rape of people that they believe to be on the other side. At one point, the Whites butcher a lot of Red soldiers and Red supporters and cut up their bodies and put them on rail cars and mark them fresh meat destination Petrograd, and then send them on the train to Petrograd. There's also a White Terror that takes place during this period where they kill 80,000 supporters of the revolution. And in response to this, of course, there will also be a Red Terror, where in September of 1918, the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, are going to start establishing these work camps, and imprisoning people who they can't just outright kill. The Civil War, by the way, is going to continue until 1922, and during this period, like we saw in Revolutionary France, about 2 million Russians are going to flee abroad and become émigrés, and they're going to resettle in Britain and France and Germany and so forth and so on. So, obviously, we'll just go ahead and put it on the table. The Bolsheviks, the Reds, are going to win the Civil War for reasons that, if you're looking at the map here, should be relatively obvious. Even with the support of the British and the French and the Americans, it's going to be real tough for the Whites to hold on. Number one, because a lot of the land they control is very rural. It's not worth very much. They don't have a lot of industrial assets that obviously the Reds control by being in the West. But more to the point, the Whites are a much less unified force than the Reds are. The whites are made up of a lot of different people, some moderate liberals, some conservatives, some nationalists, and therefore it's very, very difficult to keep their goals focused and centralized. So we are going to see that they are going to lose the war, and the as they begin to sort of win the war, as they begin to retake control of the country, Lenin and the other Bolsheviks are going to establish the so-called Soviet Union. Again, a union of all these workers' councils, the Soviets, right? It's technically referred to as the Union of Socialist, or pardon me, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. Um, so, what does foreign policy look like in the USSR? Well, number one, in March of 1918, the Russians signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This treaty is basically their desire to get out of the war at any price. In fact, and this is very, very important, when Lenin was sort of campaigning among the workers to gain their support in the period leading up to and then after the October Revolution, he said that his motto, and he sort of repeated this over and over, it was chanted at rallies a lot, was land, peace, and bread. Okay, land, peace, and bread. And obviously redistributing land and making sure that everybody got fed was going to be very, very difficult without peace. So peace with Germany was obviously Russia's highest priority. At this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918, Russia gained that peace, but at a relatively high price. They gave up a lot of territory. In fact, if we go back, you can see here all this territory in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, parts of Poland. That is all ceded to the Germans as a result of this treaty. But it does get Russia out of the war. So at least that's one problem we don't have to worry about anymore. However, a lot of the non-Bolsheviks are angry. They're going to say, listen, you took a really disadvantageous treaty that is bad for Russia, it makes us look bad, and is costing us, in other words, what did millions of our men bleed to death for? You're giving it all away, which is sort of a bizarre statement to make, given that the Germans were pushing deeper into Russia, and the Russian army was on the verge of collapse. But that's another story. There's also a question of, okay, now that the revolution has begun in Russia, is it our duty to carry that revolution forward into the rest of Europe? And Lenin was very much of the opinion that, hey, this is just the beginning. Within a few years, all these other countries will have adopted. The proletariat will have risen up in Germany and England and all that sort of stuff, and we'll be living Marx's dream essentially. That ends up not happening. But in 1919, there is a group that is established with the support of the Bolsheviks called the Communist International, and this is an organization that is set up to support and encourage revolution outside of Russia. So we're going to see the Communist International working to establish communist parties in Latin America, in Southern Europe, in Asia, in a variety of different places. And then, usually when we're going to hear about some kind of communist rebellion in, pick your place, particularly during the Cold War, that's being managed with Russian support through the International. So that'll be something to keep in mind as well. Now, in terms of domestic policy, we will start with looking at domestic policy under Lenin. In February of 1918, he is going to institute what is called war communism, which is basically saying, all right, guys, listen, there's the way that this whole communism thing is ideally supposed to be done, but we're in 2 wars right now. We can't afford to sort of wait for things to sort of work themselves out. So this dedicated crew of revolutionaries that has brought you into revolution, we are going to make sure that everything comes out the way that it should. So the first thing they do is nationalize all the land. All the land, regardless of whether it belonged to you or to another landlord or whatever, now belongs to the state. They are also, in order to feed their armies, going to forcibly requisition supplies, which is to say, they're going to go out to these peasant communities and essentially take their food, which is not going to be particularly popular. They are also going to work very hard to sort of turn the poor peasants against the wealthier ones. They're going to say, hey, these sort of well-to-do peasants, they're a part of the bourgeois just like the landlords are, and you should be supporting us and taking their stuff so that we can support the war effort and all this stuff. These wealthy peasants, by the way, are called kulaks. That's Kulaks. Kulaks. So obviously these moves of taking food and sort of fomenting all this trouble amongst the peasant population is going to generate some peasant resistance. Meanwhile, um, the Tsar and his family had been placed under house arrest first by the provisional government and then by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and they had actually been moved to this town here, Yekaterinburg, which was sort of in the Urals, and they had been kept there. They were subsequently executed by the communists in July of 1918 because a white army was getting very close to the town, and they were concerned that the whites would capture the town and take the Tsar and his family back, and then the Tsar and his family would be sort of a banner around which the white army could continue to rally and gain support. Now, there is some question as to whether or not this is something that was sort of ordered directly by somebody like Lenin or Trotsky, or whether or not it came from somebody lower down the totem pole. We're not exactly sure, but what we do know is that the Tsar and his entire family were executed and essentially buried in a shallow grave. This is a story that I always tell in class. It is an intensely personal story. And so for that reason, I'm not going to tell it here because that's a very important moment that I want to cast in a very specific light. So we'll be going through that in class. But certainly, the execution of the Tsar is going to demonstrate, hey, there's no going back. Around this time, the Bolsheviks are also going to adopt the name the Communist Party. And they're going to sort of try and directly connect themselves more clearly to Marx's ideology. They are also going to really take much tighter control over the state. A lot of those local Soviets and Zemstvos, these sort of semi-democratic organizations that had been popping up either during the revolution or in some cases during the days of Alexander II, those are all being eliminated. And essentially, Lenin and his dedicated core of revolutionaries are saying, in the name of the people, we are taking charge here because we know what's best, right? And this really gets back to sort of the cornerstones of where Marx and Lenin differ. They are using mass terror to control the populace. Again, this is very much an autocratic state, even though there is now no longer a czar. And he basically says, look, when we're talking about stuff in council, we can debate until a decision is made, but once that decision is made, everybody's got to follow the party line, and if you don't, this is what is going to happen to you. So it's pretty tough. Then in March of 1921, he is going to start easing off some of that a little bit. He's going to introduce what's called the New Economic Policy, or the NEP. And basically the goal is to deal with the massive sort of damage that's been done to the economy by, a decade of war and suffering, the loss of those territories. And basically all you guys need to know about the new economic policy is this. The government keeps control of a lot of the big heavy industry, weapons, steel production, all that kind of stuff. But they are going to let some peasants, some small businesses operate according to market conditions. So it's a mixture between capitalism and communism. It is it's Lenin backing off a little bit on sort of the brutal autocracy and stringent state control that we saw out of war communism in 1918, right? He's saying, okay, look, I recognize that, the war communism, it got us through the war and everything, but it wasn't super efficient. A lot of the peasants are unhappy. Let's back off just a touch. Now, meanwhile, we have somebody else who is coming up through the ranks of the party, and that is Joseph Stalin, or Joseph Stalin, I should say. This is him as a young man. His name, that is not his original name, it's a name that he adopted. It means steel in Russian. He was actually not born in Russia proper. He was born in what is now the nation of Georgia. And he, again, because he was involved in being a revolutionary, he actually was exiled to Siberia multiple times, but he kept escaping. So I don't think anybody would doubt that he was an exceptionally tough guy. He came up through the party quite quickly and became closely connected in during the period of the revolution with people like Lenin and Trotsky. He actually helped Lenin draft a document called the Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia, which again, very clear allusion to the French Revolution here. He became a member of the so-called Central Committee, which was that sort of the core of that dedicated group of revolutionaries. He also became the editor of the Bolshevik newspaper, the Pravda. Um, but he, even though Lenin was the main guy, he and Leon Trotsky, who we met earlier, they quarreled a lot. Um, Trotsky, Trotsky generally favored this notion of sort of permanent revolution. He wanted to spread the revolution across the entire world immediately. Stalin was more of a guy who said, you know what, we need to get things right in Russia first before we start trying to spread Marx's revolution across the rest of the world. So in 1922, Lenin actually had a stroke and was partially paralyzed. And so after that, Stalin began taking increasingly greater control over access to Lenin, who could get in to see him. He'd say, oh, no, he's not feeling well today. Leave it with me. I'll take care of it. I'll make sure he sees it. And then just sort of taking greater control over the party at large. He became the party's general secretary, which was a relatively important position, and he starts appointing various buddies of his to important posts. And really, as Lenin is getting sick and dying, he dies finally, by the way, in 1924. Stalin is really moving to take control of the party and in some case reverse Lenin's policies. Lenin, for example, after the period of war communism was starting to back off a little bit, not only economically, but also giving these nationalist groups like the Poles and the Kazakhs and the Ukrainians that had been advocating for either independence or self-rule. He was getting ready to back off and give them a little more freedom, a little more room to run. Stalin very much reverses that. He says, "Hey, there's only one way to go, and that's the Russian way." After Lenin dies in 1924, he completely takes over, in spite of the fact that Lenin, prior to his death, warned everybody, listen, Joe Stalin is dangerous. You do not want him taking over when I'm gone. In spite of that, by the time Lenin dies, Joseph Stalin is too well positioned for anybody to oppose him. And the first thing he's going to do is ensure that his opponents, particularly Leon Trotsky and another gentleman named Zinoviev, are expelled from the Central Committee and exiled. He accuses them of murder. He accuses them of being enemies of the revolution and all that sort of thing. In fact, Trotsky went into exile in Mexico and was living there in 1940 when some essentially Russian secret police and spies tracked him down and drove an ice pick through his brain. So this was very much a personal as well as a business vendetta between the two. So other things we need to know about Stalin. First of all, he is going to engage in a lot of propaganda that is going to emphasize his own greatness and his connection to Lenin. Um, well, anybody who is familiar with modern Photoshop will be able to look at this image and tell that there's something about it that's a little bit funny. Stalin had himself edited into this photograph to make it look like he and Lenin were really, really close buddies. Also, there are a lot of other photos of Stalin where basically it started out as him with a bunch of these other revolutionary leaders, and then somebody would disagree with him or upset him, and they'd either be executed or exiled to Siberia, and suddenly new copies of the photo would come out that omitted that other person. and then somebody else would get in trouble and they get rid of them, and so then all those copies of the photo would be replaced with a new one that said, so he was literally sort of wiping these people out of history in a lot of ways. So economically, Stalin's first big move is going to be the so-called 5-year plans. These are designed to modernize Russia and to increase industrialization. Stalin is looking at the same problems that all the Russian Tsars have been looking at basically since Crimea, and going, guys, we got to be able to catch up to these Westerners. We're too far behind places like Germany and Britain to be able to compete effectively. So these 5-year plans had actually originally been proposed by Leon Trotsky, and Stalin is essentially just going to take them and call them his own. Step one of the 5-year plan is to collectivize agriculture. That is to say, the old way of doing things was everybody owns their individual farm, and everybody farms their individual crops, and everybody sells their crops individually to somebody. And Stalin viewed this as too inefficient and not communist enough. So they collectivize agriculture, which is to say we take all those small farms and combine them together into one big farm, and then everybody works that one big farm together as a group. So it was designed in part also to try and bring in these rural peasants. Like we need to get them to toe the party line and to go along with what sort of the industrial workers are already doing. It is immensely unpopular because a lot of these peasants are feeling like it's forcing them back into a state of serfdom. Many of them resist by refusing to turn over their harvests to the state, and they are killed. Many of them set fires to their crops or kill their livestock to prevent the state from taking them. A lot of those wealthy peasants, those kulaks, are just straight up deported. And of course, as a result of the inefficiencies of these government policies and all this resistance from these peasants, agricultural production drops immensely. And in the first half of the 1930s, somewhere between 7 million Russians starved to death, and another 2 million are deported. In spite of the failures on the agricultural side, on the industrial side, the 5-year plans are pretty wildly successful. Russia experiences economic growth in some points of up to 27%, which any modern nation in 2015 would just kill for. But the problem is, it's not necessarily planned very effectively. A lot of these new workers aren't really effectively trained, and we're actually going to take a look at some Soviet workplace propaganda. So, famously, there is a statement/joke that is made about this period that, okay, yes, heavy industry grew immensely. We had tons more coal and iron and steel and chemicals, but we were real short on consumer goods. So there's no toilet paper, there's no baby bottles, right? And so it is a plan that is certainly imperfect. Now, in addition, Stalin is going to engage in a number of what are called purges. As he gets older, he continues to see the need, and we already saw this in those doctored photographs, to get rid of a lot of the people that originally had worked with him, but sort of wouldn't go along with him once he became the great leader. And some of this seems to have played on his natural paranoia. Actually, during the Olympics that took place in Russia not too long ago in Sochi, one of Stalin's sort of like summer houses was actually in that area, and they did a bit on TV on the house, and they made note of the fact that it was painted green and set way back deep in a group of trees so that nobody would have an easy time sort of spying on the house from a distance. He intentionally had all the floors left really creaky and noisy so that he could hear if anybody was coming up behind him. So incredibly paranoid. And he famously said, if you kill one man, it's a tragedy. If you kill a million, it's a statistic. So there are tons of people that he labels as terrorists or as enemies of the state They are pursued by the secret police and by the KGB. Initially, they are punished largely by being sent to Siberia and forced to work in labor camps, but then later on, a number of them are executed. And particularly for the important ones, they have these elaborate show trials, which are sort of broadcasted over the radio, so that we can see, Stalin's regime sort of tearing down these men, showing that he's not to be questioned, and making these supposed enemies of the state look bad, and so forth and so on. They were executing people as young as 12 years old. And then, of course, we already mentioned the murder of Trotsky. So, we actually have them in some cases even crossing international boundaries to do this. In particular, in the late 1930s, Stalin is going to be particularly worried about the Russian army. And he is going to go after a number of his high military commanders. Of the 80 sort of high officers in the Russian army, these are your generals and your field marshals and that sort of thing. 75 of the 80 were executed in the late 1930s and early 40s. And obviously, when we get into World War II, this is going to leave the USSR in very, very bad shape, because all their senior commanders who had all that experience from World War I and from the Russian Civil War are all gone. They've all been killed. This period of these purges is sometimes referred to as darkness at noon, after a book that was written on the topic, a book that actually is narrated by a man who is in prison and is about to be executed by one of Stalin's firing squads. Fascinating book. If you ever get a chance, I would highly recommend it. Also, a number of you probably for school either have or will read a book by George Orwell called Animal Farm, which is also an allegorical novella that is about the rise of Soviet Russia, as shown through these various pigs and horses that live on this farm and represent the various proletariat groups within Russia. If you have not been required to read that up to this point, I highly recommend it. It is an excellent, excellent book. And when you find out what happens to Boxer, it will totally ruin your life. And then we can talk about it and work through it together. It's like a form of therapy. So, anyway, last thing I want to mention is Soviet culture. In spite of the killing, there is this sense that is really sort of managed by Soviet propaganda, which, by the way, is exceptionally good during this period. It puts forth this notion that, hey, we're entering forward into this new egalitarian society where everybody is equal and everybody's working together. There's a sense of utopianism to it. And so the art is based on a couple of things. Number one, as you see, very, very sort of crisp design here. This is very much, in some ways, kind of sets that style that we're going to see that's so popular across the world, really, in the 1940s, 1950s. Everything is very, very realist and very functional. For example, you look at the architecture of the period, right? I mean, certainly like these sort of apartment buildings and some of these government ministries, there's not a lot of flash, right? We're not going to see any Corinthian columns or carved gargoyles or cherubs or gilt work or anything like that, right? This is a workers' culture, so everything's going to be very blocky. Everything's going to be drab. A lot of it's going to be gray. It's going to be lots of concrete, and as a consequence, it's not very pretty, to be quite frank. If any of you ever get a chance to spend any time in Berlin, which, as I'm sure you are aware, was divided at one point between an East Berlin that was controlled by the Soviets and a West Berlin that was controlled by the German, or pardon me, the British, Americans, and the French. So very capitalist, very Western. The Western side has a lot of really neat architecture, glass and steel, and some really creative, non-linear stuff. Whereas East Berlin is just kind of blocks upon blocks upon blocks of these big concrete slabs, basically, that people live and work in. but at the time it was seen as, ah, yes, look how beautiful this is. We've escaped from the sort of the debauchery and the unnecessary fluff of the Romanov era, and now we're in this new simple sort of utopia. And then of course we definitely want to make note of the fact that a lot of the artwork is going to sort of portray that same thing. Like, we're going to show working class people doing working class stuff, but now we're doing it for the state. We're all working together cooperatively, and this is what we do, right? This is the time during which the hammer and the sickle become, sort of these great symbols of Soviet Russia. And again, the hammer representing industry, the sickle representing agriculture, right? This is the union of all the working classes. Um, Another thing that I'll sort of point out as a sort of social issue is that um, initially women in Russia are going to receive a lot of equality. During the early part of the revolution, everybody is referring to each other not as sir or madam, or they're all calling each other comrade, right? It doesn't matter what our gender is or what our sort of social class was. We're all comrades. We're all working together to build a better Russia. And so initially, there's going to be a little more women's equality associated with this movement. However, the deeper we go into it, particularly once we get into the Stalinist era, um, those equal opportunities are going to wane as these women are going to have their sort of role as child rearers emphasized. And we're going to see that happening in a lot of these sort of dictatorial, totalitarian, fascist states in Europe, where people will be saying, "Hey, women, you need to have a lot of kids so that you can raise the next generation of good communists." In this case, they're going to be getting rid of means of birth control and abortion and all that kind of stuff. So in some ways, it's sort of a rebirth of the cult of domesticity along these sort of nationalist lines. Thank you guys for bearing with me. I know this was a long one. That's all I've got. So I will be back with you another time. I will leave you with this image. This is Uncle Joe red wine, which is something that is actually sold in American stores that comes from the former Soviet Union. So there you go. Couldn't skip out on that.